Ladies and gentlemen, our program will begin in just a moment. Ladies and gentlemen, our program will begin in just a moment.
Alan, I have you on this one.
You have me?
Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Today's program is brought to you in partnership with Jewish Insider. You can sign up for Jewish Insider's daily kickoff by visiting www.jewishinsider.com. Protests have erupted in all 50 states following the tragic death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota. As we mourn yet another needless death of an African American in police custody, we and our fellow citizens confront once again the most fundamental questions about our society, the enduring gap between its principles and lived realities, and what additional steps we must take to fulfill its laudable promise. Today, we are honored to be joined by Lonnie G. Bunch III, one of our nation's preeminent scholars, thinkers, and activists on these urgent topics. Mr. Bunch is Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and an AJC Project Interchange alumnus. He will be in conversation with Melanie Marin-Pell, AJC Managing Director of Regional Offices. After we hear from Melanie and our esteemed guest, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, that's questions plural, or use the Q&A chat feature in Zoom. Before turning it over to Melanie, I would like to introduce Alan Rich, Executive Council Member, Chair of AJC's National Policy Commission, to provide some introductory remarks. Alan, you have the floor.
Daniel, can you hear me?
You're good, Alan.
Oh, good. Well, I don't know if I'm good, but I'm on. Recent ongoing events, to quote my dear friend, have forced us to confront the reality that despite gains made over the past 50 years, we are still a nation riven by inequality and racial division. The state of our democracy feels fragile and precarious. What do we do? As Americans, it seems to be our nature to all too often confront profound issues as if we are sprinters seeking a quick solution where there isn't one. And then, as if we suffer from ADD, we move on to the next issue of the day. We must instead pursue true racial equality with the perseverance of a marathoner while not losing the intensity of a sprinter. We must also not only speak out, but also learn to be better listeners. Only through listening can we achieve better understanding. Approximately 15 years ago, two strangers found themselves stranded on a wet, windy, rainy night at the airport in Indianapolis without transport back to Chicago. After sizing each other up, we agreed together to rent a car to drive home. Thus began a journey stretching over the subsequent years where we discovered the striking similarities, but also the profound differences in our and our people's respective historical experiences in America. Today, I consider that stranger to be a most cherished friend. It is my privilege and pleasure to introduce my fellow stranded stranger, Dr. Lonnie G. Bunch III, Secretary of the Smithsonian. Prior to becoming secretary about a year ago, Lonnie was the founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, an institution that so effectively addresses the history of our nation, both glorious and deeply flawed, through the prism of the Black experience. Today's discussion, moderated by AJC's Director of Regional Offices, Melanie Marin-Pell, will focus, as titled, on the ongoing struggle for racial justice in America, but also, I hope, that Lonnie may share with us some thoughts on where we should and must go from here. Melanie and Lonnie, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Alan. And thank you, Lonnie, so much for being with us. It's really a privilege to have you. And thank you to all of you who've joined us today. We know there are many of you who may be not terribly familiar with AJC. AJC is the premier global Jewish advocacy organization. We have 22 offices around the country, 15 overseas posts, 37 partnerships with Jewish communities around the world, and we advocate for the Jewish people, the state of Israel, and the democratic values that unite us all. Our country is facing unprecedented struggles and challenges, and as an organization with a long history of involvement in the civil rights movement, this conversation is particularly important to us. Lonnie, you're a historian. So before turning to the events of today, let's look back. This week marks the 99th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre, where the business district in the heart of the Black community in Tulsa was destroyed. Hundreds of people were killed and injured. What can we learn from that dark day, and what were the lasting impacts from that community trauma?
Well, thank you for allowing me to be with you today, and I always am appreciative of my dear friend, Alan Rich. I think it's really important to realize that Tulsa was one of those moments where racism destroyed a community. Here was a thriving Black downtown of Black businesses, but many people who were not African American were concerned about how well they were doing. So they basically rioted, burned the town, destroyed people's lives, and in a way, what this tells us is that, first of all, it tells us that America often fails to live up to its stated ideals, and that often those that are hurt the most are people of color. And so what I think we learned so much from Tulsa is two things. One, we learned that there's a resiliency that people have to rebuild their communities, to rebuild their lives, and to basically, even in the darkest moments, people realize that they dream of an America yet to be. And so rather than the Tulsa folks being sort of saying, it's time to flee, America's not going to be fair to us, they said it's time to rebuild, but it's now time for us to continue to challenge to make our country better.
Thank you. So moving to what's happening today and the situation in which we find ourselves today, it has taken 400 years to get to this boiling point. This did not happen overnight, as evidenced by what you just, your remarks on the Tulsa Massacre. We know that there are certain inequities that are essentially baked into the American cake and cannot be fixed by the passage of a new law or a simple policy change, although those are critically important. What are the greatest gaps? This is a big question, but what are the greatest gaps in equity? And while we have made progress, to be sure, what is holding us back from more rapid progress on racial justice?
Well, I think, first of all, let me answer that big question by continuing to step back historically and to frame this. I mean, I think that, on the one hand, somebody said to me, oh, is this a unique moment? I think there's some unique characteristics, but the reality is this is something we've seen over and over again, whether it's Tulsa. I mean, at this moment, I keep hearing the words of Ella Baker, who was an important woman who helped to shape the civil rights movement. And over 50 years ago, she said, until this country views the death of Black mother sons as important as the death of white mother sons, we who believe in freedom cannot rest. So for me, this is really a moment that is part of a long trajectory of where individuals are destroyed by racism, where the institutional racism increases the number of African Americans who are in the criminal justice system. In essence, what it strikes me is I could name for you the list of names, from Trayvon Martin to Eric Gardner to George Floyd. But what I think we really need to recognize is that this is a moment to look at some of those inherent inequalities that have shaped this country. I am really struck by the educational gaps, the fact that African Americans are not graduating college at the levels that I think we'd love to see. I think even when you look at the educational system, what you're struck by is the percentage of African Americans who are in the K through 12 who don't have access to technology. So they're already falling behind. I think I'm struck by the fact that I live in Washington, D.C., and I can drive a mile from my house and see people who have been left behind, see the lack of economic opportunities and what that means to an inner city neighborhood. So for me, it's really about both addressing legally and politically what needs to happen, but also recognizing that without educational opportunity, without the opportunity to really have the life you want to live based on the jobs you have, we're going to be back at this moment time and time again.
So I want to follow up on that with something that I'm sure perhaps you've heard before, a narrative you've heard before. Some might look at you and say, you know, what inequality? Here's this incredibly qualified historian who worked hard, earned his appointment to his position as secretary of the Smithsonian. To some, you are proof. Barack Obama is proof. There are others that are proof that there are no boundaries or issues of access. So what do you say to those who question that? I want to dig into that a little bit deeper.
On the one hand, I say, don't see the exception as the rule. That in essence, there is no doubt you could make strong arguments, and I do it all the time, that America has changed, even in my lifetime. From being a kid that remember seeing signs that said, you know, white only, to being secretary of the Smithsonian. It's an amazing transformation. I agree. But on the other hand, I think that if you look at the totality of the African-American experience, granted there's a growing middle class. You don't have the same percentage of people in poverty as you once did. But on the other hand, it is still so much higher than it should be. The percentage of African-Americans in prisons is frightening to me. And that what I realize is that I am one left turn away from being George Floyd. That there is a fragility, regardless of who you are, of being African-American that says you can run afoul of the institutional racism that is still strong in this country. So I think that I'm proud that I can point to Barack Obama and say, there's possibilities, there's hope, there are examples of people who have really done very well, but I am more worried about those that are left behind, those that are locked in a sense of not believing in the fairness and the possibility of a country. So I am proud if people look at me and say, see, I can do that as well. But I also want people to recognize that there are a lot of people who I know who should have had the same opportunities that I have and who have not and have fallen by the wayside.
Thank you. So turning back to the protests of today, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, much attention has also been given to the destruction, to the looting that have followed what have otherwise been peaceful protests around the country. We know the vast majority of protesters are there peacefully and purposefully, and yet these incidents of vandalism and property destruction, among other things, among being just fundamentally wrong and criminal, invite police intervention that can then lead to more confrontation. What is your sense of the dynamic at play here, and help us talk through and work through some of what we're seeing?
Well, on the one hand, I think it's important to recognize that protest is the highest form of patriotism. It is the way that people who are voiceless say, here's how I can make a country better. Here's how I can ask a country to address fundamental issues. And we could talk for a long time about the impact of protests. But I think the challenge for us is to recognize that there are always going to be people who are going to take advantage of an opportunity to loot, to steal. There's some concern I have that there's evidence that white nationalists and others who aren't interested in the actual cause of racial justice are taking advantage of this situation for their own ends. I think it's important more than anything else, and I hope that all the protesters feel this way, that what they're trying to do is, one, to remember George Floyd, and two, to point a nation's attention to the possibility, opportunities of change. And my concern is that when people focus on the looters, the breaking of the windows, it actually turns everybody's attention from where it should be. It allows people to believe that the key to responding to this is more force, is more control, rather than recognizing that what you're seeing is a practice that has changed not just America, but protests changed South Africa in the anti-apartheid movement. Protests during the civil rights movement led to laws that fundamentally altered and opened opportunities for people like me. So my concern is that I don't want to see any violence, but I don't want that violence to take our attention away from what this is about, which is root causes of inequity, which is about institutional racism, and about an opportunity for a country to actually look at itself candidly and say, maybe now is the time we can make that change.
Thank you. And the Jewish community is certainly also no stranger to protest. In fact, our CEO, David Harris, was at the forefront of the Soviet Jewry movement, where a massive protest in Washington really helped create that tipping point for action, which was so critical. I want to turn a little bit to Black-Jewish relations. And again, thank you for the friendship and partnership you've shown to AJC and to the Jewish community over the years. You are an alum of AJC's Project Interchange, and we're so proud that you traveled to Israel with us and that you were able to see firsthand some of the complexity of Israeli society and of Israel's political and geostrategic reality. Unfortunately, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is often framed, I would argue erroneously, as a racial conflict, with Israelis framed as white, even though there are many, many Israelis who would not identify themselves that way, and Palestinians as people of color, with a power dynamic there with the white oppressing the people of color. And this has negatively impacted Black-Jewish relations, as we sometimes find ourselves on the opposite sides of the issue of Israel, which is an issue obviously deeply held and felt for so many in the Jewish community. And it's sometimes hard for people to agree to disagree on this one. So how do we avoid this becoming an insurmountable rift that prevents us from working together to advance what is truly a shared anti-bigotry agenda, certainly here in this country?
I think in a way, the last line of what you just said, that the opportunity for an anti-bigotry agenda, the opportunity to recognize that there have been long moments where African Americans and Jews have been able to find common ground, to be able to sort of, through that common ground, help to create the NAACP, help to change the way people have thought about their country. I look at the relationship among many African Americans and many Jews during the civil rights movement, that here were some of the first people to say, this is my struggle too. I'm going to the South as well. And so what I think has to happen is, first of all, we've got to remember what we share in common and to make clear that through that common unity, we can actually affect some profound changes. Then we have to realize that this is about a relationship of equals. And a relationship of equals means that you're not going to agree on everything. And I think until you can actually say, here are the things we're doing in common, it becomes easier to use the Palestinian issue as the wedge to separate us. I think that there are people who are always going to see that through a racial lens. But I think if it's part of a broader panoply of things that we're doing together, then I think we can move forward. I think this is too difficult a time for Blacks and Jews to be separated. Too difficult a time not to confront what are differences. Fundamentally, there are differences over affirmative action. That was one of the rocks that splintered a Black-Jewish coalition. But I think if we can approach this as equals, not one group better than the other, then I think we have the possibility to really affect profound change in this country.
Thank you. You know, just staying on this, and you referenced some of this, when we look at our history, we know we have so much shared work of which we're so proud. AJC is incredibly proud that we funded the landmark research of Kenneth Clark that was the underpinning of the Brown v. Board of Education decision that showed, his research showed that separate but equal is not in fact equal. So we are incredibly proud of that. There have been many watershed moments where we've stood shoulder to shoulder, and we really need each other. Racism still plagues this society. Anti-Semitism still plagues this society. We need to be visible and vocal allies for each other. So you started to answer this question, but I want to ask you if you can help us understand a little bit more about what is essential both to rebuilding the Black-Jewish relationship, as you began talking about that, but then also, how can we be better allies? What is it that we can do to speak about racial justice and inequality in ways that will be heard? And again, I think to your point, speaking as equals, but so that we're not seen as tone deaf or as privileged by our Black friends and partners, and that it doesn't devolve into the oppression Olympics we sometimes see when communities compare trauma or seem to compare trauma.
I'm always struck by when I see right-wing racists, when I see the sort of people who were causing the great pain in Charlottesville, what I realize is, who do they hate? People of color and Jews. So in some ways, the notion ought to be is to recognize we are in the same boat together. That we are, in the minds of some, what is wrong with America instead of what was right with America. So I want us to start from a position of we really need each other. We're made better by our collaboration. But I also think it is really then demonstrating that there are these moments where we actually come together as equals. I've been really taken by the variety of things I've seen with AJC, talking to different groups, people of color, working with the groups to be able to say, we're trying to understand each other better. And I know it sounds like, you know, a 1960s guy, but I really do think the interaction of getting to know who we are, what we believe, it really is the foundation for us to move forward. I believe strongly that we as a country need this unity in order to make sure that we have the resources, the creativity, and the resiliency to battle. Because it's something that Alan said when he introduced us, is that often we view this as a sprint rather than a marathon. And one of the things that I think is important to realize is to be able to look back as a historian and say, here's where profound change happened. Here's where tipping points. Here's where moments where Black-Jewish relations made a fundamental difference. I was always struck by the relationship between Black women, white women, and a variety of women coming together to protest anti-lynching, to find, you know, support to get anti-lynching laws. Even if that failed, it told me the strength of what happens when people come together. So for me, it's really using this history and then recognizing what are the things that divide us, and recognize that it's better for us to come together to fight not just an invisible enemy, but an enemy that is really visible and clear about who they hate. And so I think we're better by doing that fight collectively.
Thank you. And we look forward to continuing to do that with you and with the Black community. I want to turn back to something that we spoke very briefly about before, and we alluded to it a little bit, and that is about the nature of protest and the role that protest has played throughout history. And what is it, in your estimation, that will make this moment and these protests have a lasting impact? What is it that needs to happen in order for this not to just be a flash in the pan, as it were?
I think you've raised a really crucial point. When you look at the moments that we've had great crises where the country said, oh my God, what is this about? Whether it's after the riots in 1919, the Red Summer, whether it's looking at the urban disturbances in Harlem in the 40s, or in the sort of cities during the 1960s. What you really see, though, is you see that people are coming together and saying, here's the commission report, here's what went wrong, and here's what we can do, and then that goes into a library shelf. What I think needs to happen is, first of all, is to recognize that one of the things that's missing is that these demonstrations, which are amazing around the country, which are driven by social media, but they're still disconnected. I think that the 60s, one of the great strengths of the 60s was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, actually bringing people together to say, here are the strategic moments that we can accomplish by demonstration and protest. I think Dr. Martin Luther King realized that the key for protest was that it would lead to something else, whether it would lead to legislation, whether it lead to concerns from during the Cold War that America looked bad in the eyes of the rest of the world. So what's missing is the overarching strategy. What's also missing, candidly, is political leadership of all stripes, from the highest down to the local level, to be able to sort of operationalize, for lack of a better term, this time in our country. Where I am, and the reason why I am hopeful, I'm not sure I'm optimistic, but I'm hopeful, is because when I see the diversity of people who are coming together, it really means that people are beginning to realize that this is an issue that shapes the African-American community, but it's an issue that profoundly shapes all of us. And that sense of collective ownership is part of the key to moving forward.
I think that is a really great moment for us to pause and turn it back to Daniel. I know we have lots and lots and lots of questions from our very large viewing audience, which is really, really important and wonderful. So Daniel, I'll turn it over to you to take some of the questions we're getting from our listeners.
Thank you, Melanie. And yes, we have many, many questions coming in. Our first question actually comes from Tina Salerno in Oklahoma City. She asks, as a historian, can you put the current protests in a historical context for us? Does this moment have any parallels?
I think that this moment has many parallels. In fact, that's the sadness, too many parallels. That there are, you look back at the number of African Americans who were lynched in the late 19th and early 20th century. You look at all that's happened from Trayvon Martin to Amadou Diallo to Eric Garner. What you really see is this long tradition of racial violence and racial hatred. But what you also see is that coming out of those moments, there are attempts to change. And you can look back and say, one of the most horrible moments in, let's say since World War II was the murder of Emmett Till. It's his mother was somebody I knew well, and she demanded that the casket be open so the world would see what they did to her son. But what that did is that reinvigorated the civil rights movement. It brought people together and said, we have to take to the streets, we have to change legislation, we have to address the Supreme Court. So for me, the parallel is that this has happened many times, but can we use it to be part of that long marathon of transformation?
Thank you. Our next question comes from Philip Green in Arlington, Virginia. There is a perception that Black-Jewish relations were once perfect, including iconic photos of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel marching with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, and today that Black-Jewish relations are very troubled, perhaps best captured by photos of protesters holding signs equating Ferguson and Gaza. In what ways are these images representative or not of generational differences? Was it once perfect? Is it now very troubled?
I think it has always been a relationship that has had tensions. I think that, there are people who sort of argue that even the creation of the NAACP, the notion was someone like Du Bois considered an equal by many of the Jewish community who were supporters of the creation of the NAACP. There are long tensions that go back to issues of landlords and renters. So it's never been a relationship without bumps. But what it's been is a relationship that said, we have got to overcome this because the struggle is bigger than these bumps. And I think that what you see today is partly, I think you're right, you can see it through a generational lens. But I think that what the difference is that now, if we move forward in this collaboration that I want, it means that we're going to have to be really candid with each other and clear and recognize that we're coming as equals, struggling to make a country better. I think that's really the difference between the earlier and where we are today.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Janice Ellen in Atlanta. Without any doubt, this is another boiling point. As a historian, Can we take any positivity from the fact that there appears to be broader support from various communities to commit to changing racial inequality in this country? Is this a difference that is important?
I think the difference is on a couple levels. First of all, I think what you want is national ownership of this issue. So the fact that I'm seeing people around the country demonstrating, demanding change is really important. Where I take hope is that I'm hearing from some police chiefs and people, local mayors, who are addressing these issues, who are saying, you know, this relationship between the law enforcement community and the African American community has been really horrible and problematic. And there are some things we can do to change it. I was moved by listening to the police chief in Minneapolis basically saying all the officers who were there were culpable, whether they were on this man's neck or his back, they were culpable because they didn't stop. That you never heard before. So to me, that gives me some hope that we're seeing that change. Where I worry is I want to see that change being embraced by the political leadership at all levels, because that's part of what's going to help make this marathon move forward.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Jerry Siegel in Vancouver, Canada, and I should add that we're receiving a number of questions along these same lines. Many of the protests have been organized under the banner of Black Lives Matter. It feels that this movement is having a renewal of energy. What is it we should understand about the movement and about its relationship to the legacy or establishment organizations in the Black community? And can you help us distinguish between the broader Black Lives Matter movement and the Movement for Black Lives, which is a policy-making entity that has, among its many policies, some very harsh criticism of Israel that has made it problematic for many in the Jewish community?
I think that it's important for us to, on the one hand, to be clear about what the policy issues are that divide us, so that we can make sure that we address those. Because we got to understand that there are issues that the African American community feels strong about. Some of those are issues that can be reshaped by our relationship with the Jewish community. I'm also struck that, however, what gives me hope during this moment is that I am seeing a new generation of leadership coming forward. People involved in Black Lives Matter, people organizing these local movements, because clearly what's happening is, as a generational shift, you're not seeing the traditional civil rights organizations providing leadership. They're involved. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund, crucially important in terms of fighting this fight. But many of the older line organizations are a step behind. So this is also a moment where we look to see what are the new partnerships, what are the new leadership models that will allow this to move forward.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Alex Lipsky in New Jersey. We always hear about Martin Luther King and the legacy of nonviolence as the main driver of the civil rights movement, but there was civil unrest in the 1960s as well. Are we wrong to remember the civil rights movement solely as a movement driven by peaceful demonstration? Is that revisionist history?
I think what we really need to do is look at the freedom struggle in the post-World War II era. Some of that is a Southern struggle, and some of that is taken by the nonviolent actions of Martin Luther King and John Lewis and others. And yet, even those nonviolent actions were met so much with violence. But also, you realize that part of the transformation was that there were other things going on. There were the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee trying to register votes in Mississippi, in Alabama. What you also have is urban unrest that is really saying that, first of all, the conditions in Newark or New York or Baltimore were different than the conditions in small towns in the South. I would argue that what changed and gave the civil rights movement its strength was the moral vision of Martin Luther King, but also being able to draw from how do we fix and address the issues in the city. People who were afraid of Malcolm X suddenly saw Martin Luther King not as a radical, but somebody acceptable. So I would argue that it's all these different pieces that push the country forward. And that what was clear about Martin Luther King was he was seen as a leader for Black and white Americans, so people could look to him for clarity. But the truth of the matter is, the movement was made better by so many different pieces, some outside the traditional civil rights movement.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Oscar Abramson in Palm Beach. Some have made the case for reparations as essential to resolving the injustices perpetrated against Black America, in which they were systemically prevented from sharing in the economic blessings of America for centuries. Others see reparations as perpetuation of a narrative of victimization. Are reparations a serious tool for national healing?
There are people that are going to give you a very different answer than I'm about to give you. I really believe that I would like to see reparations defined as resources to ensure adequate education for African American youth. I'd like to see reparations be used to provide, almost like the GI Bill did for veterans, the opportunity to make sure there's home ownership for first-time homeowners. I don't think that reparations, in my mind, is give everybody a check, but rather use those resources to make sure that the windows that I got through are going to remain open for future generations.
Thank you. This question comes from Lucas Murch in Dallas, who says that I was excited to learn that you went to Israel with AJC. What were some of your takeaways from the trip?
I have to be honest, that was one of the most special trips for years. That trip was done when I was just starting to build the African American Museum, and it was done a little differently than traditionally. It was bringing together 15 people who were part of my orbit, some staff, some board members, and we arranged so that we would have the opportunity to explore the issues of Israel and Palestine. It also allowed us to sort of look at the spiritual communities there, but it also allowed us to look at the museums. And to be honest, everybody that was on that trip, we still say to ourselves, next year in Jerusalem, because it really was unbelievably special for us. I think it was special on several levels. One, AJC did a brilliant job making sure we had the opportunity to engage with different communities. I remember a night so clearly meeting with sort of one of the leading rabbis of Israel, someone from the Christian community, and somebody from the Arab community, the Muslim community, and they talked about the strengths and the failings of their religion. And it moved us so much to see holy people talking about where they think they did well, but where they worry about the future of their religion. For me, it was an opportunity to understand more about Israeli issues. It was an opportunity for me to understand more about what the West Bank was all about. But more than anything else, it brought my team together. And we, to this day, feel that that trip was one of the foundations that allowed us to build the National Museum of African American History and Culture.
Lonnie, I'm going to jump back in. First of all, thank you for that answer. That is gave me goosebumps actually to hear you say that. That's quite something. I want to also, I feel like we can't have this conversation without acknowledging the fact that we are still in the midst of a pandemic. And this pandemic has impacted communities of color disproportionately as well. The pandemic has also created an economic crisis, and this all is connected to one another. And I'm interested in your thoughts on not just, we see how it's impacting communities of color, but what can we learn from this? What can we do differently? What needs to happen next so that we are addressing, again, some of the inequities in access to health and some of the underlying issues that are making this even worse for communities of color?
I mean, I think that, as you framed, this really is a dual pandemic of illness and racism. And it's a perfect, horrible storm. And I think that, however, what it means is that as we recast what the economic growth and forecasts are going to be, as we rethink how we handle our medical community, our medical healthcare systems, as we think about this maybe coming back later, those gives us opportunities to really make sure we begin to redress some of the inequities that this has really revealed. I am struck in so many ways by the impact of the virus on the African American community. It's amazing to me to see places that were once safe are now places ripe with fear. And for me, that fear is really something we have to address, but it's the opportunity that it gives us to think about transformation. And so my hope is that we don't go back to business as usual, that we recognize that this moment has illuminated some dark corners that we now have to address.
Thank you. Daniel, I'm going to hand it back to you for what I think will be one of our last questions. If not,
we have time, I believe, for two final questions. This question comes from AJC President Harriet Schleifer. She asks, having represented many Black children regarding their state and federal educational rights, I felt dismayed at the lack of resources available to them when funding is predicated on local property taxes. Have you worked on different funding models for public education?
I think what we're doing now is many of the people who are working on public education are really saying that you can't solve these problems if you don't change the economic model. And so while I'm not an expert on that, I'm grateful as I'm hearing people around the country say that that economic model is really as equally as important as the other steps we want to take to increase and improve education for people of color. So I know that's an important step in this fight we're in.
Thank you. And our last question comes from Ella Plovsky, but again, we've been receiving a number of questions along these same lines. I have read and been educated and moved by books like The Fire Next Time and Just Mercy and Between the World and Me. And I'm wondering what other books you would recommend our audiences read to learn about the Black experience, and perhaps expanding on that a little bit about what our community can do moving forward.
Well, two different things. One is I think that there's an amazing plethora of literature that's come out that's really important. I mean, first of all, I always start everything with James Baldwin. I always think The Fire Next Time, a book that's been around for a long time, is still very powerful to help us understand who this community is and what it can do. I'm always taken by a book by Amani Perry called Breathe, A Letter to My Sons, which really encapsulates in a very personal way the burdens of race and the challenges of being young Black men in this country. There's a fascinating book by a lawyer, Benjamin Crump, called Open Season, which looks at the legalized genocide of people of color. And then I think one of the best scholars in the world today is Ibram X. Kendi, who has done brilliant work on anti-racism. His book on anti-racism, he's got a new book out called Stamp, which looks at racism, anti-racism, and you. I think so I think there's a lot of really very powerful work that's being done. I also think there's some really good literature fiction that is being done that is really helping us understand the communities that we both represent.
Melanie, back to you.
Lonnie, I want to thank you so much for guiding us on this journey with you. Again, I know this is a conversation that we could continue for many, many hours. We know you're quite busy, so we will not keep you for many, many hours, but I want to thank you for this. You've given us quite a bit to think about, quite a bit to chew on, and we look forward to working with you and together alongside you as we continue to try to build the world in which we want to live. I would also just like to note that yesterday marked the 1-year anniversary of AJC's launch of what we call our Community of Conscience, which is in essence our effort to try and bring together people of different backgrounds, faith communities, ethnicities, etc., and really speak to the values that we all hold so dear and really work together to create the society, a just society in which everyone stands shoulder to shoulder as equals. So we're proud of that. And we're just, again, so grateful to you for everything you've done for us. And with that, Daniel, I will turn it back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. And thank you again, Mr. Bunch. We truly appreciate it and that fascinating conversation. I also want to thank our audience for joining us and showing your commitment to the topics discussed here today. In these unique times, while so many of us are separated from our family and friends, AJC is still bringing us together on the issues that matter: please consider making a donation to AJC so we can offer you more programs like this one. Visit ajc.org/donate. Our next Advocacy Anywhere program will feature a conversation with Jeffrey Goldberg, acclaimed journalist, editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, and friend of AJC. This program will take place tomorrow, Thursday, June 4th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. I hope you will join us. And lastly, for the first time in AJC history, AJC will be holding a virtual global forum, which will take place during the same week we were scheduled to be together in Berlin, June 14th through 18th in 2020. This 5-day online event will feature a moving opening plenary, conversations with world leaders, spirited debates, and the high-level content you have come to expect at an AJC Global Forum. For more information and to receive updates and announcements in your inbox, please visit ajc.org/global forum. Thank you again for joining us today. Thank you again, Lonnie. We really appreciate it. Please stay safe and healthy, everyone. Goodbye.